today's Nic Voge or Vogue Academy Talk is on habits, and specifically James Clear's book Atomic Habits, which I mean, I have the a hardcover, and it's sold over 3 million copies. I'm sure it's sold even more now. New York Times bestseller. So this book obviously struck a nerve for a lot of people, and really, a lot of people. I'm sure there's momentum. Just you find people reading in your office, so I better read that book, and so there's some momentum. The crowd or herd mentality. But yeah, I mean, as we talked about a little bit last week, I think Duhigg's book, The Power of Habits, a couple years ago was very, very popular. James Clear acknowledges his indebtedness to Duhigg and his work, but he wants to go beyond that. So to kick us off, um, tell us what your initial thoughts about this book and perhaps why it's so popular.
Yeah, well, I first heard about from some students who really liked it, and I found it helpful. I think the question I had too is why is it popular? And I have some generous interpretations and less generous interpretations of that. But I don't. I'm not sure why. It's probably be very curious. By the way, I'm looking at I had an online version which says that the book has sold over 25 million copies. I mean, I think so. I mean, I think so. Maybe one of the reasons it's popular is I think he is working. He's saying some things that people want to hear. Like it's not you, it's your environment. But sometimes I will say that something like that. Making it small. I think this idea of continuous self-improvement and striving and 1% better appeals to a certain group of people. The language on there, it's little, it's easy. This is the subtitle, an easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones. So I think, that's an appealing pitch. So I think those might be some reasons why people like the sound of it. I think he's got a very confident writing tone. So he comes across as this is it. It's very clear. He appeals to the brain a lot. Brain does this, brain decides. It's the things that I actually take issue with. And so I think it has the appeal of I think he simplifies human behavior in ways that are appealing to people. And then he gives us framework, a model that he calls a behavior that suggests ways to change it that are probably pretty actionable for people. And I think some of the ideas follow from are really good,
Right.
and I've used them, but I do have some reservations, which I'll leave for later. But how about you, Matt? What do you think is appealing in general and maybe to yourself?
Yeah, I think I agree that I think a lot of us are discouraged with ourselves because we do
Mm.
make New Year's resolutions. I mean, even right now we're still in the early part of January, and I laugh at how many the gym commercials as I watch the football playoffs and whatnot.
Mhm.
And it's like, oh, you're gonna get out there, and yes, this is the year. Finally, I'm gonna do it. And then come late January, February, like, I'm the same. It's the same thing. So there's a sense of discouragement, hopelessness that I can't make changes. And then you get a book like this that says, well, actually, you can do it. It's not such an overwhelming task. And so to create really easy steps, some actionable steps that are quite easy, that I think that's very, very appealing. And you're like, oh, and he's not wrong to say that in fact there are some I mean, he does use the word hacks, but some kind of easy hacks, like little
Yeah.
things you can do to make some that will over time mount up to quite big changes in your life. And so, that's going to be very appealing to a lot of people. I think it'd probably be good for us to give a quick summary
Yeah.
of those, because he basically has 4 laws of behavioral change. 'Cause I think that's how he frames it.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, 4 laws of behavior change. One is to make. I'll just list them out, and we'll have a thing up here. Make it obvious. These cues that then make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying. And the way he does that is, how do you develop good habits? So there's a positive way to do these four laws, and then how to get rid of bad habits. You just do the inverse of those four. So I wrote down some obvious. So for making it obvious, if you're struggling to work out, he's like, well, then put your workout clothes on your bed. So when you wake up, it's right there. You're like, okay, I gotta do my thing. Or if you want to read more, do put when you make your bed, put a book right on your pillow. So at night you're not scrolling through social media. You're like, oh, I'm gonna read my book. But those are like ways like to create very obvious cues. Make it attractive. So let's say you want to go out and do more walking, get outside more, then well, that's when you listen to your favorite podcast. Only when you walk or only when you jog. Something like those are ways to make it attractive. Like, oh, I really want to listen to that podcast. I got to go for a run or I have to go for a walk. That's way to make it attractive. Make it easy. Instead of just saying, okay, I'm gonna work out for 2 hours, which you might do twice, then you're like, oh, that's exhausting. There's no way I'm gonna do it. You just say, all right, I'm gonna start off just working out for 2 minutes. Or some short amount of time, and just start that. And then, that's a way to ease into it. And then, as you do it more and more often, then you can expand the amount of time you're exercising. And lastly, just make it satisfying. Somehow, how do you reward yourself? Like, do you put a big X on the calendar every day that you exercised, or share progress with someone else, have an accountability partner, and then those are the four laws. And then then to get rid of bad habits, you would just do what are the cues that make you do that bad habit? Well, how do you make that unattractive, or make them, or not unattractive? That's how do you make it so you get rid of those
Put obstacles in the way,
obstacles
inhibit.
away, and so on and so forth. And then again, just I won't bore people with examples, but just make for every way to develop a good habit, you can get rid of a bad habit by doing the inverse of that. So that's my jumbled
I thought it was
summary
good.
of the book. And a couple things that are in there as well is, and I think this is, I don't know if you agree with this, Nick, but he does say that often we think we have to change our motivation first before changing our habits. And you say, well, sometimes you can change the actions, the habits, and then the motivations will follow. And I was thinking about that. I was like, well, because after a while, as you exercise more and more, there is the motivation to exercise because it becomes part of who you are, you enjoy it and whatnot. So I was like, okay, that's a fair point that,
Yeah.
there are times where, you know, okay, I'm not motivated to work out, but I initially, but over time, it becomes so part of my routine and who I am that I want to exercise. So that's a good point. And then lastly, he does start off, and I'm not sure he carries this through the whole book. This is one of my critiques, is he talks about identity. Um,
Yeah.
and he starts off, and I was like, oh, this is so good. As someone who studies existentialism, I'm like, oh, identity, thank you. But I don't think it carries through the rest of the book. I think he comes back to it towards the end, but I didn't really see it interwoven throughout the whole book, which I would have liked to have seen. Nevertheless, it is a good point that on the one hand, he doesn't make this
Right, this is
claim.
chapter 2, how your habits shape your identity and vice versa.
Right. Yeah, I just you know, on the one hand, there is an assessment of who you are right now. And to do that in a non-judgmental way is really hard. I can't recall, I don't think he really does a like, you know, to say that, yeah, I don't work out, and I'd rather work out. And there's a way to say, can you accept the way you are right now and then allow that dissatisfaction? And it's okay to be dissatisfied with yourself. And it's one thing to beat yourself up, it's another to say, okay, I just need to be honest with who I am right now. And then that allows me to move forward because I want to be someone different. But he does emphasize a point which is good. It's like, well, who do I want to become? And that I think is a good way to frame any changes you want to make in your life. Because it is about who you are. It's not just, we could talk about productivity hacks, but who are you as if you want to be more productive? what does that say about your identity? He doesn't get into that so much, but I mean, the
Right.
point of being self-aware, self-reflection that he discusses in the beginning of this book, I thought was quite good. Anyway, there we
Well,
go.
I think, I think I made the point to you. I think this is my thesis, is that this is a set of techniques and tools that are good for changing or beginning to change your behavior.
Right.
But it's more like a scalpel, in my view, right? It's a very specific kind of intervention at the level of behavior. Um, but it's ultimately kind of described more like a Swiss Army knife, like everything becomes habits. So I think, to be unfair a little bit or be critical is, well, the reason identity goes away is because I don't remember reading something like what you just described. Well, in my mind, I'm feeling this and I have this different feelings and I have some guilt, but I have this aspiration. Like that complexity is not there. He might say, oh, people have feelings or emotions, but not what they are or the substance of them or the content of them, like that we're getting at. So, well, an identity is not a behavior. I mean, that's pretty far away from behavior. So I think it's hard, and that's a difficult thing to resolve. I might have appreciated some acknowledgement of that, but you know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, this doesn't do everything, but that's not a selling point of most books. But um, uh, so I think, and we're both, I was attracted to that idea too. Oh, identity, self-concept, sense of who you are, your worth, and that's a approach that is not based on hacks. It's not primarily behavioristic. So if you go look at, I think it was chapter 3, he goes back to Edward Thorndike. Definitely not. Thorndike was not introspecting. He was studying behavior of animals as models for human beings, and saying, hey, we're basically the same. Like, well, we're basically the same except for all the stuff that goes on inside our mind,
Right.
which is a lot. Any case, and different motivations and what have you. So I think that's right. I mean, I think that's the limitation. We can be constructive and add to that, and say, hey, this is a missing piece, perhaps, or missing dimension. But nonetheless, they're still very powerful tools. And I think back to your initial point, you're asking me, does motivation follow from action or behavior? Yes, absolutely. Does motivation? So then that's a counterintuitive statement for many people. My objection to that is then it is a slippage to, then we don't need motivation, or motivation only follows from action. No.
Right.
You said sometimes, and I was yeah, absolutely. So then people fall in love with this counterintuitive, and I can do the same. Or it becomes the single lens. And I think that's we talked about that last time, how the single lens, if you look at the world through habits, you can explain everything in terms of habits, but that's a highly abstract, rational, that's not based on observation of human beings, right? So I think there's a little confusion here about, if you jump to the end, the appendix about the model and the insights about human behavior. He has a model of habits, then he applies to everything, and I think that's a mistake. And he doesn't have evidence, right? There's not much evidence that's offered. There's no data. He's not citing studies typically, nor even many stories from other people about what they've done. That's okay, but it's saying, here's this model. Let's spin out the implications of that.
Right.
I'm all in favor of that. That's a useful thing, but it generally spins the implications then are hypotheses, more or less, or things to try out. Fantastic. As a practical solution-oriented thing, you can try these things out, but that's different than when you start to say human beings are this. So I think that we have a model of behavior becomes human beings. You extrapolate to the model of humans. No, that's not. We are not reducible to our habitual behavior. That is not true. We are more than that, and that's where the complexity of identity and self-worth and other kinds of altruism. Where's altruism in this? But most of the great things in our society that have been created are altruistic. Well, okay, that's okay. You don't have to explain all of human beings, but then don't pretend to explain all of human behavior.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking that yeah, this is it it is a temptation to want to reduce everything to that which is measurable, what I can see, and
Hackable,
what
traceable. Yeah.
yeah, whatever can become a dial that I can change. And so even, I mean, he does talk about emotions a little bit, but it's in terms of dopamine hits and, you know, this needs and cravings. And so even there, it's, I feel like the human spirit, this dynamism that's really elusive, in a way you don't want to deal with it because you can't nail it down.
Yeah,
So it's much easier to at least unintentionally become reductionistic and say,
that's
well,
right.
you know, it's all dopamine hits, you know, and so or it's your environment and all this stuff. So then, and then when we do that, then it's like, oh, great. Then I just need to
Yep.
make this little change, little dial, and everything's great. And then, and you know, we have to admit that it works. I mean, you do. We can be lab rats. We can be, we, you know, like animals are going to, you know, largely be products of their environments and whatnot. And if you just think that, oh, we're just the same, you know, that we don't, you know, which you know, I can't prove, but I'm going to claim that, you know, humans are unique from the rest of the animal world in this quest for self-identity and this dynamism of self-worth inside of us. You know, animals have a lot of, we share a lot of characteristics with them, but I don't think that's one of them. And so a lab rat isn't going to at some point go, hey, what am I doing with my life? You know, like
Right.
I'm just in here this maze every day, you know, like, do I really want to do this? You know, where and humans can be like
Can.
that,
Yes.
but,
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
but as we say, we don't, they don't have to be, and in fact they shouldn't be. And that's, you know, where we're trying to say, you know, yes, we are, a, a lot of subjects in psychological studies are a product of their environment. And so it's easy to say, well, then all of us are products of our environment.
Right.
And it's like, no, 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 that's not true. And you know, if you're watching this video, you know, you should say, no, I am more than that. Yes, it's not to mean that you're utterly and absolutely distinct from your environment. The very fact that we're speaking English right now, and you know, it means that we're product of that environment, that, you know, and the idiosyncrasies or whatever of the English language in our Northeast context, but we're also more than that. So that's where I feel like there's we have to appreciate where he's helpful, but also where he's limited in terms of
Yeah.
his understanding of human nature.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the clear statement of that actually comes out as in the appendix. And that's what I was kind of getting at. No, I was, uh, and I do want to come back to what I think are some of the strengths and the most useful things for me, but it's remarkable how much language in the appendix where he little lessons from the four laws, which there's a language that looks a lot like Buddhism. Interestingly, I'd be curious to see your. I think he's got it reversed. He. I mean, we should generalize the laws from experience, from the insights about human beings, and say observations. So he put a model and then spins out these things, as I said before. But you know, I think about the fundamental impulse to change. You say, I'm dissatisfied, I'm unhappy, I want to change. Well, that's not a habit, right? So you
Right.
already have a paradox. I also think that, you know, and I'll stop beating on the guy. Although maybe this isn't actually, I think this is an appeal. This idea of a 1% improvement, and you're continuously improving because you're continuously dissatisfied. That's at some point he makes that essentially that argument. And then so if you're continually trying to improve, and you're embracing that continual dissatisfaction, this is called the hedonic treadmill. This has been observed, and it doesn't feel very good. So if your goal is to be optimally productive, then embrace that. But the Buddhist perspective would be that it is, though most people are dissatisfied by having unmet desires and wants, one need not necessarily be in that state. There's other ways to redirect our attention and our emphasis and our focus. And that there's a whole another way to intervene in these human tendencies, which is not just to feed them, but to actually direct our attention, use our body and mind and will and desire to come to another state, to view the world differently. So I think he brings a very conventional view of human beings, and I'd say there's other ways to think about that. But some of the, I mean, so, but maybe we'll circle back to that. Well, if you want to ask me, if you want to follow up on that, I'm happy to say more. But one way I made a note to myself: do you want to be happy or constantly improving by wanting to improve? And then his definition of wanting is suffering. The gap between where you are now and what you want is suffering.
Right.
But he's saying you should be continually in a state of suffering, according to him.
Right.
You should be. That's a normative claim. Like, well, I don't know. There's other ways to interrupt that. Find satisfaction, fulfillment in non-material self-improvement. I don't know. That seems like it could work.
Right. I guess, well, we'll come back to the positives, but I want to, I think I one thing I want to speak about is I mentioned this story where when I was at Princeton University, I was in a management something or other program. I can't remember what it was. And there was this class, and we were looking at
right.
Like
a training, a professional development training.
Professional development training in this class on how to really support your team and the folks you're supervising. And it was this I can't was it Pike? What's the guy's name? Talks about how to motivate other people.
Oh, Pink.
Right. Sorry, thank you, Pink. Daniel, was that Daniel?
Daniel Pink, that's right.
Yeah. It was great. I mean, I think we're all motivated. Basically saying, just giving people rewards is not ultimately what they want. Anyway, I think the class was kind of based on that. But the funny thing was, it was like it came across as, well, by really, telling your I hate to say employees, but your team how great they're doing, so that's going to help them be more motivated to work and be more productive and so on and so forth. And it was kind of this lab rat kind of thing, like how do you give more, I mean, not rewards, but it was somewhat manipulative, because it was like, well, am I trying to just make my team more productive? And so here's the means to do that by just telling them how wonderful they are and what a great job they're doing. And I broached that with the facilitator in the class, and I just got the stare like, what are you talking about? How aren't we just manipulating people by figuring out how that they're somewhat dependent on me for their sense of work and recognition, and so I need to leverage that to make them that much more productive. That's basically the message that came across. And I said, well, boy, that really, like I said, sounds manipulative. And what kind of view of human nature do we have?
And what role do we want to have with people?
Yeah. I mean, and part of it's like, it seems so great, like you're praising people, but then I'm like, well, what's my motivation for doing that? Is it really, am I really, like you mentioned altruism, like, is it really altruistic to be praising people? Because really, I just want them to be more productive. That seems more selfish, in my opinion. And that's not even examined. And I'm like,
Right.
And so the same thing is operative here in the sense with ourselves. Like, I'm just trying to make myself more productive. And these are productivity hacks. But then it's like, well, why would I want to be more productive? Like, I mean, you talked about self-identity at the beginning, but that doesn't become a point of tension or struggle or examination in the actual body of the text going forward. That why would you want to be like, why do you need to be more productive? What is it about you? Those self-reflective questions.
Right.
So.
Well, and one of the things I would add is it's counterintuitive, but is the way to be the most productive to directly pursue productivity?
True.
So I think this is not true. I think that's what Pink and others have said is If you pursue meaning, purpose, fulfillment, intrinsic motivation, that's particularly certain kinds of productivity like innovation, creative problem solving. Those motivations are much more likely to lead to that kind of expression of productivity. But I think from my point of view, I've intuitively, from my self-worth theory and intrinsic motivation framework, always tried to motivate for their growth and satisfaction, believing that was the way for especially ongoing productivity. It's one thing to have maybe apply these principles to a particular project or a sprint to a solution, but on an ongoing basis where people are coming in every day for years, I don't know how sustainable that relatively superficial merely to produce, to
Right.
increase the number of something. I don't know how engaging for some people probably, but I think there's lots of evidence that people don't. They get the gold medal. They got to a certain time. They got and actually Clear talks about it. I got a certain number of people signing up for my there's a little anecdote when he said, when I forgot my first 1,000 people reading my blog, it was a big deal. And then I was having 1,000 dead. I didn't even recognize it. Now he interprets that, oh, I should give myself praise. That's what his response is. I might say, well, what does that say about numbers?
Right. Right.
Yeah. And where the fulfillment is actually coming from. Yeah.
So can I just, before we, I have another thought that I'd be curious to get your feedback on, or your thoughts. The one thing about habits is that they do allow us to, why we are habitual creatures is that it allows us to direct energy and willpower more efficiently.
That's a good point. I think he started
Yeah,
that.
which is a good point. I mean, like, willpower is not an inexhaustible resource, and so you only have so much of it, and that's why we form habits, because it's just less energy we have to devote to, tying our shoes or brushing our teeth, whatever. We can think about other things that we need to um, um, do in our day. Anyway, but and so it's to think that, okay, um, we're such habitual creatures and we have all these habits, and so how do we kind of modify them to make us more productive or whatever? What's interesting is that in a way that could be seen that, like, this is, I think this is relevant, but to me, like, I am someone who likes to have my day ordered, the habits and things happen here and there, but then we're constantly throwing curveballs,
Yeah.
disruptions and whatnot. And the question is, how do you respond in those moments? If you're so reliant on our habits, do you get frustrated? Do you see that as an inconvenience? This is to your point about altruism, really. Like, how do you respond in those moments? Because if you're so focused on productivity and whatever and that way to measure yourself, then those inconveniences really are inconveniences, and versus opportunities to um, you know, you um, be helpful to someone else, or just stop your whatever you're doing that day and your need to be productive and give that person a ride or spend an extra hour or something. You know what I mean? Like, there's all these opportunities
Mhm.
um, that can be seen as an inconvenience and really disruptive to your goals and
Yeah.
whatever. And um, I think for me, I am someone who wants to control the day, who wants to have everything ordered and my scheduled upheld, that it's taken me time to be like, okay, I need to have a posture where if I'm I'm just gonna use the word inconvenienced, then that's not an inconvenience. I need to be fully present in that moment to really be thinking of
Yeah.
how best to help that other individual or group. I don't know. I mean, your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting where you ended there. It's important to be fully present. So one of the arguments here is we want to automatize things so our minds can be elsewhere. You just said, no, we want to be exactly in the moment present.
Right.
So this is a fundamental, right? So there's a way that's very compelling. We human beings can automate even very complex processes, and in fact, we do. That is the tendency, though. And so I've been getting back into reading and critical reading and intuition, and so very complicated, sophisticated mental processes of bringing lenses and analyzing and making inferences are automatized. We're not even aware we're doing it, particularly as experts in our domain. Now, on the one hand, that's what the human mind can do. And so this book says, because we can do that, do it. But Buddhists and I think mystics, and in a world where there's lots of flux and change, would say, do you want to train yourself to not be present? Really? You want your mind elsewhere? Because that too is habitual. So I think that some place was really fundamentally different. So one thought as you were talking, I was thinking, well, habits, another word which I might prefer is routine, and schedules. David Allen, who, I don't know if you know him, he has this book, he has this approach called Getting Things Done. His whole approach is that way of thinking, of planning things out and scheduling, is from another era in the highly volatile change, all kinds of unpredictable, lots of the information economy, people you're so often digressing from any plan, it becomes unhelpful to make it. And we should approach planning in a very different way. So I wonder if, to some extent, if this is in some narrow aspects of our lives, like in the morning when have your time and you're trying to create an exercise routine that's highly controlled, great, use this. But in other times, maybe not so much because of the nature of this situation. But even just the idea that or the strategy, you said, I want to be present in this changing time for the person or the situation in front of me. But the rationale for this is, hey, we can automatize things so my mind can be doing something else. And that's part of it. So that was my response. And I think the point is that humans can do that, but there's still a judgment and discernment about when and we can and we don't want, we want to be purposeful. And that's not a habit. Being purposeful, putting this in service of a larger goal for other people, I don't think those are best thought of as habits. I think those are thought of in terms of goals, right? And aims and purposes and meaning. And so we need to combine those and then use habits as tools and techniques that are designed for human tendencies, but we're not reducible to habits. This is a description of certain element or dimension of human behavior, but then is not a model of human beings. That's the thing I worry about.
Right.
This is a model of certain behaviors or ways of approaching behavior, but not human beings.
Yeah, I mean, because I don't want to in any way imply from our discussion that we're saying, oh, just chuck out this book. I'm
No.
like, oh, yeah, there are actually some good ideas and things I'm
Absolutely.
looking at in my own life here, but it's also the case that, as we said, I know I have a tendency to become fairly rigid in my schedule, and thus not so pleasant when I'm interrupted or disrupted in my daily life. So then, how do I use these in a way as a tool that's held loosely? I guess like, yes, I will. Um, I'd rather, I'd love to be reading more. So how are ways that I could use this book to cue me to be doing that? But then also, there's just times when I'm got my cues and everything ready to go, and someone needs some help, or can I be like, hey, my productivity needs to be suspended here, or my want to be reading more in order to do something that actually, in the big scheme of things, is much more important, which is to be helping the person, or so on and so forth. So it's a both and, not an either or. Because
That's right.
also, because I was thinking, like with the mystics, I mean, they were people of rituals. That there was a rhythm to their daily lives that formed certain habits. So it was fine, but they also, there's one contemplative that I have folks read when they want to start down this path of is a gentleman named Brother Lawrence, who was a 17th century lay brother in a Carmelite monastery in France. But he got to a point where in his quest to know God and in this mystical union of love, as they would call it, like this love relationship, where he was like, yeah, I'll do the daily rituals of this, that, and everything, but you know, it wasn't the rituals themselves weren't what was important, which you often see in church settings, right? Like I think of the especially like the Anglican church, like it's the rituals, it's doing this,
Mm-hmm.
having this, that's what's really important. It's like, no, 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 that those are all ways to help you grow into what's really important, which is this relationship with God. If they become what's important, then there's a problem. And it's the same thing here. It's like these atomic habits, these strategies and hacks that he's providing can be helpful, but they had to be held loosely because you are so much more than your habits.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you made the distinction. I guess we're going to stay in the conceptual realm. The distinction between a habit and a ritual. They're pretty different.
Right.
Rituals are social. Rituals have, by kind of, I think the accepted understanding is they're indexing some much bigger meaning and purpose, but they're kind of materializing that. But the point is not to do the ritual, although it's easily to get caught up in that.
Right.
Right. So there's this critique within Buddhism too. There's traditions in Buddhism that are highly focused on the rituals and doing various kinds of rituals, and then others who are saying, wait, you're missing the point. It's not to do the ritual. The ritual is a vehicle or tool to help us or one interpretation would be to remind us, right, where our attention should be. But it's not on the ritual itself per se. I think that's what you're getting at. So I think there is some similarity here, and that's, it's in the ritual is often a behavior. It's the superficial, it's the visible surface level. And I think where our approach is to look interiorly and inwardly, what's going on beneath the surface. Humans are uniquely that aspect of our action, not merely our behavior, is uniquely rich and complicated, and is rooted in meaning, and multiple forces operate on that. And so I think from my point of view, these are mostly about hacks, tools, and I don't mean that in derogatory ways, and techniques that can be used, but then the discernment of for what purpose is not necessarily handled very well, and that's okay in the book, or it's implied that the purpose is productivity qua productivity, just to be more productive, which I think if we were to unpack it, which would be to get more recognition, or more wealth, to then affirm that sense of self. And I think we would say, well, what does that actually lead to fulfillment? Are you more and more productive and get more and more recognition, but actually then don't feel what at some level you're pursuing, which is meaning, purpose, fulfillment, a kind of satisfaction. It's not merely the satisfaction of a craving, right? Which is the terminology used, but a satisfaction of your at a deeper level, right? Rewarding versus a reward.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Those are different. That thing is a reward, but is it rewarding? Right. So the word has these levels and dimensions that I think illuminate this. And I will. So I guess one thing, for instance, he uses some big names in psychology in the wrong. I think he misinterprets them very fundamentally. So Kurt Lewin or Viktor Frankl, even Thorndike that he mentions. So as someone who's has some training in psychology, it's a little like, oh, I don't think that's quite right. So I think that points to very knowledgeable about habits, less about human beings.
Right. Yeah. You know what? As you're talking, I kind of think I had this little light bulb moment where I'm going to go back to Michael Polanyi. He was saying how humans, our tacit dimension is really trying to take particulars, um, and focus our attention from the particulars to the whole. So, like facial recognition, like you can tell someone's sad, you just, but you're attending to the whole face. And then when you're like, well, how can you tell them they're sad? You're like, you can't really do it. But you're like, well, mouth, eyes, I don't know. I just know. And that's because the tacit dimension is taking in all these particulars and directing it to the whole. And from that, we have this world of meaning. And what's interesting, I don't know if I have to go back and read Polanyi because you see when we talk about reducing things down to rituals or reducing things down to habits, they're not wrong but they're the particulars, and we
The
need to
concrete
attend to the
particulars.
whole. So if it's like, well, you got to be doing this ritual, that ritual, this way, and you're like, okay, I'm doing these things, but then they ultimately become meaningless because you're not attending to the whole, which is this relationship with God, or and actually experiencing that and allowing these rituals to somehow help you in that quest. But if you're not experiencing the presence of God, eventually it's just like, well, I'm just doing these things and they become meaningless, and I'm going to leave church because and that's what a lot of people do, right? Because it just became, I mean, I grew up Catholic, and it was just got to go to mass. You had confession once a month or whatever it was. And after a while, you're like, well, this is kind of pointless. And that's my experience. No offense to the Catholics out there, but my experience was just kind of like you were just doing it to check the boxes. And after a while, you're like, well, I got better things to do with my time. Versus now, where it's like my like it is to experience the presence of God, and to experience this mystical union of love. And so I want that. So the rituals become much more meaningful and purposeful because those particulars are attending to this whole. And so the same thing with these hacks. I think if we just become so focused on these hacks and the productivity, it's these particulars. And eventually you might be getting these rewards. So like I'm more productive, and that makes me feel better about myself, or I'm getting the recognition or the wealth or the prestige or power I want. But I think ultimately a lot of people will say, great, thanks. But I think ultimately we're more than that, and that becomes ultimately dissatisfying.
Yeah, let me pick up a thread on that. I think imagine a scenario. So I was raised Catholic too, and I think I had some very similar experiences. But I can also imagine I think my parents had very different experience in Mass than I did. And so I'm sitting right next to them. We're doing the same rituals. Sitting up, stand up, sitting down, saying certain things. They had a very different experience. Well, how is that? Why is that? That suggests there's more to it than the behavior. Right? That model. If you accept that there are some people who are experiencing these things as simply mindless rituals or very relatively empty habits, but other people are experiencing them as vehicles to commune or have a certain, then you're saying human beings have different dimensions. There's another dimension
Right.
that these are related, but they are not reducible to. And so I think that's what I'd want to say. And I think when you and I look around and our previous conversations about gold medal winners or golfers, is that what leads to the kind of fulfillment, satisfaction, rewardingness, or reward is not achieved by pursuing increased effectiveness in your habits. That can help you, but it is not the end. And that's the in itself. And that's the worrisome part. And then I think the thing that I'd be concerned is this is how people then say that's the point. The point is to get 1% more productive. And I would say, I don't know what that life looks like when you're 70. That's not when I look at the world, my own experience, when I read the wisdom traditions, when I hear people who have achieved a lot, I don't hear them saying, I got to be a Nobel Prize winner by improving by 1% every day. I've never heard that. I follow the Nobel Prize. There's a website that has these accounts. Never, ever seen that, ever.
Right.
Okay. Now, is there some truth and insight in James Clear? Yes. The point isn't to dismiss it, as you said, it's to reconcile them. That's the point. It seems to me. And so what are some useful, so to pivot to that, to get to the so what and useful. So I think this idea of a keystone habit where you actually put your attention on something that helps you get started and doing an activity that has kind of entails positive cascade of events. I think that's really smart and a useful observation about sort of the arc and flow and dynamism and momentum of action. I think that's really helpful. I think another is kind of habit latching. There's some really practical tools that are laid out, habit tracking, and you could track lots of things that are not habits too, right? Like you just because you put word habit in front of it, right? You can track things and not call them habits, and that tracking is beneficial. But so I think there are a lot of practical tools at the level of practicality, um, and that and those are some of the ones that stood out for me. And I think understanding how like the fourth step, the cue craving per response reward is useful to understand automatic behaviors,
Right.
unthinking ones, and how humans have this dimension, the thinking fast and slow. There's a certain part of our behavior that's very automatic. It's a response, and to understand that we have that impulse, and that if we're not purposeful and we're depending on where we put our attention, we can succumb to that being most of our behavior, particularly in a world where we're constantly somebody else is designing our virtual environment or physical environment, then we're quite susceptible to that. But then to say, okay, we're just going to work within that realm. No, I think our
Right.
point is no, get outside of that realm as much as you can.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I thought, that again, that we're not trying to dismiss this book, but we're trying to kind of, because I feel like if you just embrace this book wholly, you'd be easy to um, get to a point where you're like, well, why am I doing this? Like, like is
I think
productivity,
so.
yeah, where, am I only about productivity? Now, again, we're in this world where everything's quantifiable, you're in the business world, everything, I get it. It's such a temptation as you're trying to make your company, your nonprofit as efficient as possible. And, um, and to get ahead, you kind of need to be that much more efficient and productive as your competition. I get it. But your humans are not just a machine, and we're not just some entity that you can manipulate to and make more productive. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be more productive. I mean, if you're sitting around watching, if you're on social media 4 hours a day, that's not healthy. And so this might be a good start. But as I guess I'm like, so I think a great thing is to look for those cues, like, and then um okay, I get the ping on my phone, and it's like, yeah, there's the dopamine, and I'm like craving that hit of that satisfaction of watching it, and then it's easy. But here again is, it's easy to say, okay, I don't want to look at social media so much, so how do I control it
Yeah.
first? And then, which is great, that's a great first step. But part of me would hope that there's a, well, like, why do I need it so much? Like, what need that's more existential of my identity?
Right.
uh is there a FOMO component to that? Is there an escapism there? um you know that dimension, which I don't think James Clear would necessarily deny.
Mm.
But that kind of self-examination is really healthy. And 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 if you're doing that in conjunction to say, okay, I have these cues, I want to do it less. And so, I realize that there is an escapism here and dissatisfaction, but, I need to take care of limiting social. I mean, like, if you're doing both, and again, I'm like, phenomenal. This is great.
Yeah,
This
me too.
book will be really helpful for you. But it's, again, if you're like, all right, Matt and Nick are advocating this kind of stoicism, mystical, Buddhist, Christian mystic kind of experience where you're no habits and you're denying the world all the time. That's that's a wrong interpretation. That's not what we're advocating. But if you are wholly embracing kind of this productivity hack myself kind of thing, which is like so prevalent on LinkedIn, other social platforms, then you're you're not embracing the fullness of who you are and what you can become and what really is at play in yourself, and you're reducing yourself to this lab rat. So
Yeah.
that's the two. So anyway, yeah. So I've been thinking, okay, there's certain things I wanted to apply from. Have you? I mean, anything in particular you're thinking about applying from his book to your life right now? I mean, you've done some stuff. I remember you used to put
Yeah.
your coffee with exercising. I remember, or
Yeah.
you used to have
I
all
mean, I
these
did
things.
these,
Yeah,
there's lots of books on habits, right?
right,
And some of them that are researched. And I mean, so I think what I would say is he gets a lot of tools for addressing the behavioral, environmental, and habitual aspects of human action, and
right,
not so many about other dimensions of action, the cognitive, the values, motivation. These are kind of diminishing these levels. And I would say, well, no. uh, this is a set of tools that addresses that. But I think it's some of this idea of a keystone habit and then how to frame, this is a cognitive dimension that he doesn't talk about. Like if you say, I'm just going to focus on getting myself to the gym, or one example I think he gives in one of his books is he talks to this person and she says, she's been working out as a dancer for 50 years. She says, I don't focus on my workout. I focus on getting myself to the cab to take me there.
right, right,
Okay, well, that's cognition, attention, framing. That's a conscious choice not to focus on the workout. Well, why? Where's that coming from? That's not a habit. That's the cognitive dimension. Your brain doesn't do that. Your mind does that. Why does your mind does that? Because your mind has made an insight about human action. None of these, right? So I think but I think that's really valuable, that idea. Make it small, narrow down, think about a first step, not the ultimate. But other times you do want to think about that ultimate. It actually feels good, but it's a pain to get there, right? Some people love to swim, and if they get in the water, they feel great. But it's the getting on the bus and then the subway to get to the pool. Well, that's not going to work then. Focusing on getting on the bus? No, because that's the part you don't like, obviously. So the point is to be flexible, to recognize it as a tool. But I do think for me, I have a pretty easy life. If I can just get started, particularly with respect to working out, if I can get started, I tend to like it. So the example you were referring to is I had a hard time. I would have to have my coffee. So I would read my coffee. What did I do while I was reading my coffee? Well, I'd start reading the paper or reading online or anything. And then I would get sucked into that, and then I wouldn't stop and then go work out. So the solution was to take my coffee and sit on the exercise bike. So when I finished it, I was there. And I think that's a kind of habit latching.
right.
I knew nothing about atomic habits at the time, but then systematizing that and understanding the mechanism. And I like the fact that the model helps you understand your own habits. Not so, yeah, there's about changing, but I do like that the model spends a lot of time saying, why do you have the habits you have and why are
Right,
they sustained? I think
right,
that's really useful. That'll give you a lens to look at your own behavior.
right. That's good. Yeah, I was thinking, how I do have these daily rituals. I'm going to stay with that language. Um, and it's interesting. Like I think there's, as I said before, there's a time where I was very rigid about those. Like those were sacred, and when they were disrupted, I was not. Here I am pursuing this mystical union of love with God, and then someone would interrupt this one part of it, and I would be frustrated with them. Which is tragic and ironic. You know, speaks to my infancy in my spiritual walk. So anyway, but that's been great to hold those loosely um, as I've grown. Um, but what's interesting with this book is I'm always thinking I need to write more. Um, and I just saw this thing about Jerry Seinfeld, who says, every day he has to write a joke, at least one joke.
Mm,
it may be terrible, but he's a comedian. This is my craft, and so I have to
mm,
be doing it every single day. And probably 80% of the jokes are terrible, but the fact that he's writing multiple, one or multiple jokes a day, and he's constantly working that muscle. And here I am, like, oh, maybe when I retire, I'll start writing more.
mm.
Because I've got like volumes of notes, and I've been studying Kierkegaard and the Christian mystic, really. And that what I've been doing is trying to integrate those two, which is fairly unique. I don't know if anyone else has ever done that.
Mm.
And you encouraged me to write a book a couple years ago, which I did. I wrote a rough draft of book, and I haven't touched it for 2 years. And it's easy to think I need to just jump right into that book. The same thing with, it's easy. Okay, I got to work out 2 hours a day versus, all right, I just need to be, do I need to be reading or writing a little bit every day?
Yeah,
Starting small, maybe just writing 2 minutes, and then, yeah, but just the craft of writing. So I'm thinking
yeah,
of ways. I haven't really thought about how best to do it, but I'm like, okay, do I need some kind of cue? Do I need to put it in a certain time of day? And how do I, all these things that he talks about, I'm wrestling with to figure out how best to write every day if I'm hoping to be more of a writer
yeah.
than I am right now.
That reminds me, I think of it. I think it's in this book, but maybe it's elsewhere. What's the smallest possible increment that's beneficial?
Yeah.
And that's countered how most of us think.
Yep. Yep.
But I
Yep.
think it's super helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that fits with what you're talking about.
Totally.
Okay, the smallest increment for Jerry Seinfeld apparently is a joke.
Right.
And that might lead to more, and then that's doable. We lower the expectations, there's less pressure. It's something I can do in the volatility of life where I may not have all these times. And I think what again where I think it's challenging is to say then that's the way, right? That is a way, and
Right.
it's useful for some circumstances. But it's not like only write one joke a day. That would be the problem.
Right. No, I think you're right. And again, this is where we're saying, these are very helpful tools. And even I mean, in a way, like our procrastination course, there's tons of strategies in
Tons.
there,
Yeah,
and
there's lots of
we're
stuff in
not
there.
saying implement all of them. We're saying
Yeah.
you have to be your own detective, your own doctor. You have to do your own assessment and figure out what's best for you. And the same thing here is, these are a lot of great tools. Can you do a really good job of assessing who you are, where you are right now, what's going to work or not work, and be your own best friend and best coach instead of being, someone who it's like, all right, I've got, like you beat yourself up and got to do this, and then you get discouraged with yourself, and it first, just it's not necessarily taking it easy on yourself. It's just to be a really good coach and friend to yourself, but also, you know, being honest with yourself, I guess, just
Yeah,
so
I think it's a
yeah,
good place to land. And then this
yeah,
book provides a bunch of it's a toolbox of of techniques you can implement yourself based upon your judgment, your self-assessment, the environment you're in, the task you're working on, and that that discernment and judgment is the part that we emphasize.
right. So I guess the big takeaway is read Atomic Habits, but always be tuned into Vogue Academy talks and our materials, and then you'll be just fine. So when 25 million folks out there and counting need to be
Come on over.
come on over to us. Nick, thanks for a great talk. This was very helpful to me, really clarifying a lot of stuff I was struggling with, and so it's just great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks to James Clear for writing a very useful book.
Yeah, for sure. All right, until next time.